Journalism for me is a natural extension of being a student at St. John's and wanting to understand the world and make it understandable to others. In my career as a journalist, I've seen a lot of societies devolve into ancient tribal hatreds, into factionalism, into losing sight of what brings people together as human beings. I covered the conflict in Congo, for example, which was a direct outgrowth of the genocide in Rwanda, and the ways in which people failed to really see one another as human. That kind of conflict feels so irresolvable and so baked into the way that people live their lives on a day-to-day basis. I spent time in Zimbabwe, where you had an absolute ruler in Robert Mugabe, and there was very little tolerance of dissent. Journalists are arrested, they're taken away from their homes. What I see right now in America is, in some ways, a fundamental rupture in our belief in a shared reality, that we see things and we can talk about things and that we can discuss things in a way that feels communal, that feels like it's something that belongs to all of us. If we don't agree on the basic terms, then how can we have any kind of meaningful discussion? One of the things I really love about St. John's is we all gather around books. There's text. There's something to guide our conversations. If you lose that text, and I feel in some ways as Americans we've lost that text, our discussions become unproductive. They become shouting matches. They become about slogans and name-calling and not about real civil discourse. And to me, that's heartbreaking because I've seen that kind of breakdown elsewhere. And for us as a country, that's not who we are, and that's not how we're meant to live. Here at St. John's, we talk a lot about civil discourse, and sometimes it's hard to know exactly what that means. It can seem like a really fuzzy concept. It doesn't mean being polite, it doesn't mean being politically correct, and it doesn't mean just sweeping under the rug the fundamental things that people might disagree on. But what it does mean is listening to one another with respect and basing our arguments on a shared reality and a shared sense of these are the books that we're reading, these are the texts that we're talking about. You can have endless disagreements about the meaning of the Bible, the meaning of the United States Constitution. You can disagree about a translation of Baudelaire or of Sophocles, but at the end of the day, we all have the text to come back to and something to anchor us in that sense of reality. And I think that St. John's has a very special place in that regard, in that it creates an environment in which we can share something, even if we disagree, even if we come to the college with very different experiences. I wish more Americans could attend St. John's and learn these skills, learn these things that we do. And sometimes I despair at the problem of taking this idea of civil discourse, this thing that we aspire to, sometimes don't quite meet at the college, and bring it out into the wider world. But I think a really important thing that the college can do, and that we as people who are part of the college family can do, is really live these truths in our lives, really exemplify them. And for me as a journalist, that means being open and listening, not name-calling, not slinging insults, but really being an open person. And being open doesn't mean that you don't have beliefs. It means that you hold on to your beliefs, but you talk about them, and you argue, and you go back and forth with people and find ways to find common ground. Here at St. John's, we have a really proud tradition of intellectual diversity. And there are people who come to the college because they believe in the classics. My father was one of them. His parents were Goldwater Republicans, and in fact, he himself was the chairman of the high school students for Goldwater before he came. So I come from a long line of rock rib Republicans. And in fact, when I was a student at St. John's, there was a very active community of conservative students, and we would have great debates. A very dear friend of mine had the Conscience of a Conservative poster in his dorm room. So I think that intellectual diversity and the idea that we can all read these books and take different things from their contents, and that they don't necessarily represent a small c conservative or big L liberal point of view, but they really represent a small L liberal point of view, meaning they're really about freedom and about making minds free. And that's what I really value about our motto, which is really about making free people from books in a balance. Freedom is an important concept, and freedom is essential to the intellectual pursuits of the college. But I think that one of the things that comes through really clearly through the course of the program is that freedom alone is not enough, that you need to have this combination of freedom and trust. And creating an environment of freedom and trust is actually a really hard thing to do. And I think that the best seminars that I've had at St. John's were ones where freedom and trust were held in this very careful balance. And when you have freedom and you don't have trust, you essentially have this kind of Hobbesian nightmare. You've got a situation in which no one can believe anyone, no one can trust anyone, and therefore no one really has liberty. No one's really free. So holding those things in balance, I think, is extremely important. And to me, that's at the heart of what I think of as intellectual diversity. It's the ability for people to express themselves freely, but also the trust that people will be safe and people will be heard, and that points of view will be heard. Uncomfortable points of view will be heard, but not points of view that fundamentally deny the humanity and the dignity of another person. So I think that's the balance that we're really struggling with as a country right now. How do we preserve the liberty of people to speak their minds, to say what they want to say, but at the same time protect the dignity of human beings? And to me, that really comes back to the program. It comes back to Hobbes. It comes back to John Stuart Mill. All those things that we read and we believe, we need to hold fast to those ideas.